Discourses by Meher Baba, Volume 2, The Place of Occultism in Spiritual Life, Part 2, The Occult Basis of Spiritual Life, pages 94 to 103, Revised 6th edition, 2007, reading by Jeff Wolverton. People constantly interacting on inner planes. Those who have even a preliminary acquaintance with the structure and laws of the inner spheres of existence know that complete isolation of human beings is a figment of imagination. Whether they desire it or not, all persons are constantly acting and interacting upon each other by their very existence, even when they do not establish any contact on the physical plane. There are no limits to the spreading of the influence of man. The magnetic influence of the subtle spheres knows no barriers of national frontiers or any other conventional limitations. Good thoughts as well as evil thoughts, cheerful moods as well as gloomy moods, noble and expansive feelings as well as petty and narrow emotions, unselfish aspiration as well as selfish ambition. All these have a tendency to spread out and influence others, even when they are not expressed in words or deeds. The world of mental life is as much a unified system as the world of gross matter. The gross world as a vehicle of spiritual life has its indubitable importance, but the links and connections existing between different persons can by no means be fully estimated if we merely consider the tangible transactions which take place in the gross world. Value of darshan and sahavas. For an aspirant to see saints and masters does not yield its full significance except in the context of all the corresponding happiness of the inner planes. The ancient rishis have attached great importance to having the darshan of saints and masters because they are the source of the constant flow of love and light which emanates from them and makes an irresistible appeal to the inner feeling of the aspirant even when he receives no verbal instruction from them. The effect of darshan is dependent upon the receptivity and response of the aspirant, whose reaction is determined by his own sanskars and past connections. Often the aspirant is completely satisfied with the darshan of the master, and he desires nothing further from him. To derive bliss and contentment from the mere darshan of the master is a great thing, because it indicates that the aspirant has desirelessness and love, which are the two essentials of spiritual life. Having had the darshan of the Supreme Beloved, the aspirant naturally desires nothing except to have more of his darshan, and is thus impelled by his inner spiritual urge to seek the sahavas, or company of the master, as often as possible. Further, sahavas of the master implements and strengthens the purifying effect of darshan, and also results in drawing the aspirant closer and closer to the master on the inner planes of life. Feet of the master. Like darshan, falling at the feet of the master also has a special value of its own. The feet, which are physically the lowest part of the body, are the highest from the spiritual point of view. Physically, the feet go through everything, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, clean and dirty, yet they remain above everything. Spiritually, the feet of the master are above everything in the universe, which is like dust to them. When people come to a perfect master and touch his feet with their hands, they lay the burden of their sanskars on him. He collects the sanskars from all over the universe, just as an ordinary person in walking collects dust on his feet. There is a hoary custom that after the aspirant has the darshan of the master, and falls at his feet, he washes the master's feet with milk and honey and places a coconut near them as his offering. Honey represents red sanskaras, milk represents white sanskaras, and the coconut represents the mind. Thus, this convention, which has become established in some areas in connection with greeting the masters, really symbolizes throwing the burden of all sanskaras on the master and surrendering the mind to him. Adoption of this inner attitude constitutes the most critical and important step which the aspirant must take in order to get initiated on the path. Mental contact. Once the aspirant has the bliss of the darshan of a master, that sight gets carved on his mind. And even when he is unable to establish frequent personal contact, his mind turns to the master again and again in an effort to understand his significance. This process of establishing mental contact with the master is essentially different from merely imaginative revival of past incidents. In the ordinary play of imagination, the recall of past incidents is not necessarily animated by a definite purpose, whereas in establishing mental contact, there is a definite purpose. Owing to the directive power of purpose, imagination ceases to be a mere revolving of ideas and reaches out to the master through the inner planes and establishes contact with him. Such mental contact with the master is often as fruitful and effective as his physical darshan. The inward repetition of such mental contacts is like constructing a channel between the master and aspirant, who becomes thereby the recipient of the grace, love, and light, which are constantly flowing from the master in spite of the apparent distance between them. Thus, the help of the master goes out not only to those who happen to be in his physical presence, but also to others who establish mental contact with him. Special precautions indicated by certain occult conditions. The master devotes careful attention to the individual needs of the disciple, and the first thing he does is to protect the disciple from influences that will divert his attention from the path or interfere with his progress. Often the master requires the disciple to accept some kind of temporary isolation so that his mind is guarded against impacts which might impede his spiritual progress. The ancient yogis, under instructions from their masters, prepared their own food and did not allow anyone to remain present at the time of eating it. The reason was to avoid impressions of evil from the glance of bad persons. A disciple is also likely to catch the impressions of another's lust, just as a clean cloth may be readily soiled by dirt. In the earlier stages, the aspirant must guard against any complications which might arise through association with others who are not on the path. But the master gives special instructions for the severance or avoidance of certain connections and contacts only when they are specially indicated for the special case. In most cases, however, all that is necessary is secured merely by the constant company of the master, and no need arises to submit the disciple to actual isolation. Although the disciple may be outwardly in touch with the world, he remains mentally detached from it because of his inward connection with the master. Helpful contacts and associations. Just as the master may isolate a close disciple from undesirable contacts and connections, he may also actually encourage and bring about new and fresh contacts which he deems to be in the spiritual interest of the disciple. He has a consummate understanding of the sanskars and karmic ties and their complications, and he can consciously help people to enter into such associations as will allow and call forth important responses and activities, and to help the progress of all concerned along the line of least resistance, or by the shortest possible route. He uses his knowledge of past lives, sanskaras, and connections of people to help them economize their spiritual energy and use it with best results. The disciple as a medium. The unity and solidarity of the inner plane makes it possible for the master to use his disciple as a medium for his work, even when the disciple is unconscious of serving this larger purpose of the master. This is possible because the disciple, through his love and understanding of the master, as well as his obedience and surrender, establishes a rapport with the master and comes into tune with him. Those who come into direct contact with the master receive his direct help, and those who are closely connected with his disciple receive the master's indirect help. The master as a relaying station. Sharing spiritual work is by no means one-sided. Even the disciples who merely think of the master or meditate upon him have the privilege of sharing the spiritual and universal work in which the master might be engaged at the moment. As he is one with eternity, the master is beyond time and all limitations of time. As he is also interested in the spiritual upliftment of humanity, he assumes many of the limitations of time, and his work can be helped by the voluntary cooperation of his disciples. The master feeds upon the love of his disciples and utilizes the spiritual forces released by them for his universal work. In this way, the master is like the relaying station, which receives a song only in order to broadcast it to the world at large. To love the master is to love all, not merely symbolically, but actually. For what the master receives on the subtle planes, he spiritualizes and distributes. Thus, he not only strengthens the personal links which the disciples may have with him, but also gives them the privilege of sharing his divine work. The internal eye. By infinite ways, the master tries to draw the aspirant into his own being so that he may be disentangled from the mazes of the universe and come to desire God. This longing for God is present in the aspirant from the very beginning, but the master makes this primary longing more intense and articulate by opening the internal eye of the aspirant. When the internal eye is opened, God, who is the object of search and longing, is actually sighted. As the gaze of the soul is turned inward and fixed upon the supreme reality, the desire to establish union with it becomes much more ardent than when the soul is groping for God through mere speculation or imagination. When the time is ripe, the master can open this internal eye in less than a second. Om point. Ultimately, the aspirant has to realize that God is the only reality and that he is really one with God. This implies that he should not be overpowered by the spectacle of the multiform universe. In fact, the whole universe is in the self and springs into existence from the tiny point in the self, which is referred to as Om. But the self has become habituated to gathering experience through one medium or another, and therefore it comes to experience the universe as a formidable rival other than itself. Those who have realized God constantly see the universe as springing from this Om point, which is in everyone. Reversing process of perception. The process of perception runs parallel to the process of creation. And the reversing of the process of perception without obliterating consciousness amounts to realizing the nothingness of the universe as a separate entity. The self sees first through the mind, then through the subtle eye, and lastly through the physical eye, and it is vaster than all that it can perceive. The big ocean and the vast spaces of the sky are tiny compared with the self. In fact, all that the self can perceive is finite, but the self itself is infinite. When the self retains full consciousness and yet sees nothing, it has crossed the universe of its own creation and has taken the first step to know itself as everything. Siddhis. The entire process of withdrawing consciousness from the universe and becoming conscious of the self is accompanied by an increasing control of all the vehicles of consciousness. Such control is made possible by the vivification and activation of unused centers of control. And the functioning of new centers brings in its train a number of occult powers. These new powers are commonly known as siddhis, and they can come before the aspirant has become spiritually perfect. In fact, egoism can flourish through the acquisition of such occult powers. The aspirant may not only take delight in possessing them, but might actually use them for mundane purposes from which he has not necessarily freed himself. Siddhis are therefore rightly regarded as obstacles to the attainment of realization. However, after God is realized, all these occult powers dwindle in their importance. The siddhis have their field in the nothingness, which is the universe, and the person who realizes God is permanently and immovably established in the supreme reality. Although the whole universe is like a zero to the God-realized person, he may voluntarily assume responsibility toward those souls who are enmeshed in the tangles of the universe. In that case, he can freely and legitimately make use of his occult powers for the spiritual good of others. Furtherance of the divine plan. There is nothing which does not admit of direct or indirect control by the masters of wisdom. Large social phenomena such as wars, revolutions, and epidemics, as well as cosmic phenomena such as earthquakes, floods, and other changes, are equally amenable to their control and direction through the release of the forces of the exalted planes on which the masters are consciously stationed. The masters can also use the occult forces and possibilities for securing cooperative and coordinated spiritual work. They frequently hold meetings and conferences on the higher planes for securing the advancement of humanity. The Oversoul in all is only one, and it always functions as a unity. Those who have become conscious of this unity become fit to undertake unlimited responsibility because they have shed the lower limitations of the human mind and have become so impersonal and universal in their interest that they are effective vehicles for the execution and furtherance of the divine plan on earth. Jai Baba.